In class, we went through the scientific method, and the way we learned about the scientific method was to do what we called the noodle dilemma. The first step of the scientific method is to state the question. In this case, the question that we came up with was, when making noodles, should I use hot or cold tap water if I want to eat as soon as possible? So in this video, we're going to go through the 6 steps of the scientific method. So if you were not able to get all of the notes written, that means if you were not able to get all 6 steps written, you can pause this video at any time. So that was step 1, state the question. So then from there, we talked about how we could further understand more about our question in terms of the scientific method. And the second step of the scientific method is to collect information. And as a class, we determined that if we really wanted to know more about whether hot water or cold water boils faster, we could look on the internet, we could ask an expert, and in many cases we said maybe your mother would know, since she's probably cooked noodles hundreds of times. So the second step of the scientific method is to collect information. Okay, now on to the third. The third step of the scientific method is to form a hypothesis. And we talked about in class how a hypothesis is an educated guess. It's not a fact. It's just what you think is going to happen. And I said I would like to see 6th graders write their hypothesis as an I think because statement. So here was the example. A boy in class said, I think that cold water will boil faster than hot water because I have boiled water many times before. So this was his individual hypothesis, and he thought that cold water would boil faster. So the third step of the scientific method was to form a hypothesis, an educated guess. The fourth, I'm going to shrink this up. The fourth step of the scientific method is to test the hypothesis by doing an experiment. And this is the part that we all like to do best. This is where we get to use our hands and put things together or do all sorts of things that will lead us to determining whether or not our hypothesis is correct or incorrect. So the fourth step is to test the hypothesis, and then in class we did the experiment to see if hot or cold water boiled faster. So we took out our 2 pots, our coffee pots that matched identically. We took out our hot plate, that each hot plate that we did this on, they matched identically. We used the same amount of water, and we checked the time every 1 minute, and then the other class, period 3, we did every 2 minutes. But what we did is we kept all of the variables controlled. We controlled our variables, and a variable is any factor that can be changed in an experiment, such as the coffee pot, the type of hot plate, the amount of water, the amount of time between taking the temperature. So a variable is any factor that can be changed in an experiment. There are 2 types of variables that you should further understand: the dependent variables and the independent variable. The dependent variables are the part of the experiment that is affected by the independent variable. The part of the experiment that is affected by the independent variable. So an example of the dependent variable in this experiment would be the time. The time was affected by whether or not we started with hot or cold water. The independent variable is the variable being tested. the part of the experiment that is changed. So our independent variable was the hot and the cold water. The hot and the cold water. So you can pause this if you need to write down anything more about variables, dependent variables, or independent variables. And once again, this was the fourth step. That's when we test the hypothesis by doing an experiment. All right, and now the fifth step, we took data down as the water was sitting on the hot plate, and this is actually the data close to being the same data from periods 2 and 3. And this was the starting temperature, the cold, and then the starting temperature of the hot and the cold. And this is how it changed. And we stopped at 8 minutes because the water that was starting at 70 degrees Celsius was boiling by 8 minutes. So that's our data that we would study, and from this data we could say, hey, the hot water boiled faster. It took a little less than 8 minutes to reach boiling. The cold water only made it up to 51 degrees Celsius. So when scientists take data down, they usually put it in some sort of a table that's easily understood by them for later study. So that's the fifth part. The fifth step of the scientific method is to record and study data. And the last step is you would draw a conclusion. And that means, do you accept or reject your hypothesis? And you would explain why using the data. And in class we did several examples that people shared where they said, I accept my hypothesis because, and then they told why using the data, or I reject my hypothesis because. So in conclusion, we walked through the 6 steps of the scientific method using the noodle dilemma in class. So what do you need to know? Well, know in general the steps of the scientific method so that when we start learning about chemistry, whenever we do an experiment, we'll be referring to the scientific method, coming up with our own hypotheses, and then doing experiments. So, state the question, collect information, form a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, record and study the data, and last, draw a conclusion. I hope this video helps you understand the scientific method better.